Good afternoon. This is Frosty Walker, Chief Information Security Officer for the Texas Education Agency. And welcome to the first in a series of webinars regarding cybersecurity. Today we'll provide a brief overview of tips and tools that are currently being shared with the education community by the Data Security Advisory Committee. But before we get started, let me give you a brief history about my background. For the last 3 years, I've served as the Chief Information Security Officer for the Texas Education Agency. Prior to that, I spent 10 years as the Information Security Officer for the Texas Secretary of State's Office. And prior to that, I spent 12 years with AT&T's legal division developing policies and procedures to prevent unauthorized access on their infrastructure. Additionally, I headed up a forensics team for AT&T should they detect a compromise on the network. We appreciate your attendance today. We look forward to working with all of you. To save everybody a little bit of time in Googling, trying to put a face with the voice, I've included a quick snapshot of me presenting in a recent conference. So I've had the fortune of being asked to speak at a variety of security conferences all across the country. We want to keep this informative today, as well as all of our webinar series. We will allow time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. Should you have a question during the presentation, feel free to submit them via the GoToWebinar question tab, and they'll be queued up and addressed during the question and answer session. So let's get started. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the Data Security Advisory Committee. About 2 years ago, we decided that we wanted to put together a Data Security Advisory Committee that was comprised of school districts, educational service centers, TEA employees, and the private sector. We wanted to look for diversity both in the size and the geographic location dispersed across the state, with people that were willing to share their needs, ideas, times, to hopefully provide solutions for everyday cybersecurity. Really want to thank those folks that have spent their time and efforts. We have people that represented Hayes Consolidated, Amarillo, Plano, San Angelo, Abernathy, Houston, Tyler, just to name a few of the school districts that were participating. So again, want to take the time to thank everybody that served on that advisory council of the committee for their efforts. But as the DSAC, as we refer to that, began to come up with some tips and tools, we needed a way to share that to everyone. The Texas Education Agency was coming up with a collaborative tool called Texas Gateway at www.texasgateway.org, and we were able to convince them to let us share our cybersecurity tips at that location. So if you want to find a recording of the webinars, they will be posted under cybersecurity tips and tools at that website. If you go to that website, this is indeed what the splash screen looks like. And as you can tell, there's a lot of information about education, there's social studies, math, history, but in the lower middle as circled, you will see cybersecurity data and cybersecurity tips and tools. So what all will you find currently in that folder? We'll find an education risk assessment. We will find a cybersecurity framework summary with 40 controls. We'll find a link to the CYBRARY, which is a valuable resource on the internet that provides free training on thousands of topics to deal with cybersecurity and IT. We also have questions to consider when we're dealing with cloud providers. We have a incident response handling red book, and we have an incident response exercises that you can work through. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the education risk assessment that's shared out there. That is provided by the EDUCAUSE Cybersecurity Initiative and the Higher Education Information Security Council. So this was developed. It is actually ISO 20001 compliant. Means that it falls under the standards and guidelines of the ISO 2001 guidelines. And we'll talk a little bit about how the scoring goes. This assessment is based on the Excel spreadsheet, and every time you need to answer something, it has a drop-down box, and there are potentially 6 answers. A 0 score is not performed. A 1 is performed informally. 2 is planned. In other words, you're actually doing some of those things and you're planning to improve that program. 3 is well defined. 4 is quantitatively controlled, where you can actually measure that and are measuring that. And 5 is continually improving. And there is a 6th choice out there, which is non-applicable. So let's take a quick look at what this spreadsheet would look like. This spreadsheet has, of course, it has places you can enter your name and who's completing it, the department or the institution, the date. I do like the fact that there is a reset the worksheet button and resets everything. And we'll go through a few of these questions, and we'll talk more about questions here for a little bit. The very first question: does your institution have a risk management program? There's a drop-down box in the next column, and there are 2 choices, yes or no. If you choose yes, it'll score you a 5 automatically in the item score. If you choose no, you're going to score 0. Now the second question: do you have a process for identifying reasonable and foreseeable internal and external risk to security, confidentiality, and/or integrity of any electronic, paper, or other records containing sensitive information? And for this example, I chose the drop-down box. It was the choice of performed informally. So you can see it created a score of 1 out there in the item score for us. The third question: does your organization conduct routine risk assessments to identify key objectives that are needed to be supported by your information security program? And I took a snapshot of the actual drop-down box here. So you can actually see, if you click on the arrow next to that for the drop-down box, you have choices of not performed, performed informally, planned, well-defined, quantitatively controlled, continuously improving, or not applicable. So this risk assessment is fairly easy to conduct because it is simply choosing, multiple choice questions. It has about 100 different questions, but additionally, I like the fact that it also has help. So as you can see out to the right, there is a big question mark and a help column. If you click on that column, you will actually get help regarding that question. I also think if you need additional help about a question in that, I would quickly Google that question and see if it can't provide you additional information. And of course, if you're working through a risk assessment and still don't have a valid answer of what you're looking for, do not hesitate to drop me an email and ask me some specific questions about that. And we'll be glad to help you with that. Let's talk a little bit about the cybersecurity framework summary. And we talk about, if you remember, when I was a kid, learning to read, there were graphics on the pages of the kids' books. I read my children books, and there was always graphics. And it seems like graphics makes it much easier to understand what you're looking at. And for a long time, I'd have people ask me, well, how secure are we today? And I'd knock on wood and say, hey, we're pretty secure. But how could I actually provide a graphic that would show someone where our security posture is at that particular time? And if I had that tool, how could I use that? What if I had a graphic that would actually show me 40 different controls and where I am today? Suddenly, I can look and see where I have success stories and where I have some issues. The numbers that you're looking at here today indeed are sample numbers, so they do not reflect the position of any one particular security plan or program. So we're going to work through some of these in a little bit, but I wanted you to see what the result of this was, because you can actually take this and show this to leadership, and you can begin to prioritize by looking at this and determine where you have needs and what you need to address, and it begins to create a roadmap for you and your security platform. Now, the red line I actually, in this case, drew myself. And that is what I have determined as a due diligence in each of the 40 categories. I worked with Gardner Research. They've come in and done 2 risk assessments for the TEA in the last 5 years. And I sat down and talked to them about due diligence and where we really needed to be at what we could actually think would be a good level that we're protecting the resources that have been shared with us by the citizens of Texas. And they came up with a due diligence for TEA of about 3.25. So I take that and draw a red line in that graph, and then I can present that to leadership and say, here's where we are today, here's where we're successful, here's where I need additional help. It allows me to prioritize, and then I can start to work with a budget about developing where and when I need to, how I can address those issues. Additionally, that cybersecurity framework not only lets me look at a snapshot like this, but then I take the overall score and I post that into a separate spreadsheet. And now I can begin to look at the security posture and the maturity over a period of time. I actually review this once a quarter. Not recommending that everybody does the same, but certainly you can take a look at that and see what is most appropriate for you. But I review that on a quarterly basis. We actually have to file this information with the Department of Information Resources every 2 years. But I quickly discovered that I couldn't remember what we had done 6 months ago. So I began to track this on a quarterly basis so that we could actually document things that we were showing improvement on and what we've done to improve our posture. And in the middle of the screen, you'll see there's a slight dip in that. You say, well, how does that happen? How do you have a drop in your security posture? And there's a lot of things that cause a dip in that. I'll give an example. For example, you might have an application that's running on a version of, let's just say, Apache. And Apache comes out and announces that there's a bunch of vulnerabilities in that version, and in order to resolve those, you need to go to the next level of version of software. So you ask your team to load up that new version of software in the dev environment, and your code doesn't work. You go, uh-oh. Somebody's going to have to figure out what it's going to take to get this to this level and how long it's going to take to produce that. So there you can have a drop down, and then you can actually see that you can have show improvement. So this actually shows you these 2 pieces of the framework summary actually show you a snapshot of where you're at one particular time, and also how your overall information security posture and the maturity is improving over a period of time. As we did with the risk assessment, we'll talk about some different levels in the summary and how we're going to score that. So a level 0 means it's non-existent. There's no evidence of that existing in an organization. Level 1, there's an initial. It's ad hoc, inconsistent, reactive approach to meeting the objective. Level 2, it's repetitive. You have a approach, but it's still mainly most reactive and undocumented. You don't routinely measure how you enforce that. Level 3, we're now moving into a defined where it is documented and we have regularly measure for compliance. Level 4, the organization uses established risk framework to measure and evaluate risk and integrate improvements in the applicable to meet applicable regulations. And number 5, optimized, where it's being continuously refined. It meets the standards. We're looking at ways to improve the capacities to be the most efficient and cost-efficient manner. As we take a look in the spreadsheet, we are going to see that we break those down into different benchmarks from the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and there are 5 categories or areas or groups that we identify a control with, and those are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So if we work through this whole spreadsheet, you would see all 5 of those covered in the controls. We're not going to work through all the spreadsheet today. We will have a separate webinar on this tool coming up in the near future. So let's take a quick look at a spreadsheet and how we could be applicable, how we might work through this. Again, it is an Excel spreadsheet. You will see here are the areas of the NIST. We just have the 11 that are classified as identify here on this example. We have each of those security objectives or controls, and we have 0, 1 through 5. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a self-assessment and put a percentage of what we think is most applicable in our environment. So we look at privacy and confidentiality. You say, well, yes, I've got privacy policies and procedures. The procedures aren't well documented, but some are. I have some applications and some procedures that are well documented. So this framework summary allows us to put 50%, say, in the defined, documented, and 50% in the repeatable, but still undocumented area. And the same thing is true with data classification. We talk about data classification, and we have certain regulations that clearly define, FERPA information. We know what's defined in Texas Business Code and Education to be sensitive information. But business owners can also say, I have some special data that may not fall in that category, but we want to treat it as sensitive information. So we need to go through and review our data classification processes to make sure that we have those in place, or whether we don't. In this case, I gave an example of a one that we have 75% that are ad hoc, and we have 25% that are defined and documented. Talk a little bit about critical information asset inventory. Oh, hey, I have an inventory of all my hardware. That's great. But that's not all of your information asset inventory. The data that's been shared with us by the citizens of Texas is also critical information asset. So we want to take a look at where do we have sensitive information. We like to be able to document. Those are in these databases. They're on these servers. So we have some record of where that is. And while we think we may be doing a good job, it still comes down that somebody comes up one day and goes, oh, you know, I forgot about this database and it's got all this sensitive information in it. Oh, well, where is that database? Well, we really don't use it, but we haven't decommissioned it yet. Okay. So again, we go through that same process, and in this case, I identified 50% as a one in an initial ad hoc, 25% repetitive, and 25% in as well defined and documented. I won't go through all of these. I will talk a little bit about control, oversight, and safeguard assurance. Actually, I do have definitions that we will put out there, more lengthy definitions on each of these security objectives. Control oversight, I think of control oversight more as to how to do in your operations. For example, do you have onboarding and offboarding processes? Are they well defined? You may be using Active Directory. You go, yes, I've got a process that removes login when somebody leaves. But what about if they have a login, you know, in a cloud application? Do you have a process to readily remove that login as well? So those are more control, oversight, and safeguard. In this case, I spread that across because you've got so many different things that some may be taken care of and others may not be. So yeah, you could spread that percentage across, you know, depending on how that works out. I want to talk a little bit about cloud usage and security. I know that is a key initiative for us as we start looking at moving more and more things into the cloud. Many people started moving into the cloud, early adoption of that technology. There was some concern about the security in the cloud, but today there are many providers that provide excellent security in the cloud. So you have to go back and review where you might have data in the cloud, and go back and take a look at your contracts to see, you know, at what level that's being supported. And if you have sensitive information, is it being encrypted at rest? I do want to talk about number 11, the external vendors and third-party providers. This is such a difficult area to try to address. We can contract with a third party, and through contract negotiations agree on several different service levels and compliance. But they in turn may contract with someone else for a part of their work, who then contracts to another third party. And so how do you begin to control all of those? And that is extremely difficult to do. So you need to kind of take a look at those external vendors. We try in the contract to negotiate, you know, say if you're going to subcontract any of this work out, we need to be notified, we need to be advised. So those are things that we need to think about in the external vendor and third-party providers. And for this example, I put 25% in ad hoc, 50% in repetitive but undocumented, and 25% in the documented and defined. So those are just some examples. And then once again, we'll go back to the graphic sheet that we had before, because this is part of that spreadsheet, and it produces this graphic. And I use this graphic in a lot of different ways. Like I said, I use this to prioritize. I use this to build a roadmap. I also use this as a budget tool. I go through and say, okay, where am I liking at? For example, I look at in this example, if I were to look at data classification item number 2, I'm going, oh, I'm scoring really low in that. But there's not an appliance or a tool that I can just go out and buy that does that for me. That's really processes and procedures, and that equates to someone's time. So I have to say, well, it would take, you know, let's just say it would take 120 hours to move my data classification program to where I'm meeting my red line. Well, that really boils down to dollars. You know, I have to come up with the staff, and I know that many of y'all are much like me, and I have limited staff resources. So, you know, it'd be great if I could bring a consultant in and pay them to do that, but oftentimes I'm not able to do that. But at least I can put that in a budget so that everybody can look and see what it's going to cost to get our information security up to where we think it should be. You know, I can look at that at the same time, and I can talk about my success stories. I go, okay, wow, I'm doing a great job in item number 32 down here, spam filter. You know, I'm hitting a home run here. But we know that spam filters don't catch everything, you know, and so then we begin to look and say, what's my next level of protection? Well, that typically would be your end user security awareness training and privacy awareness training. So those are, and if you're scoring low in that, now I know none of y'all would have users out there that might go through their junk box and see, you know, an email from ABC Welding and go, I don't remember expecting anything from ABC Welding. And they open that up and go, oh, there's an invoice from ABC Welding. And then they open the invoice, and the next thing you know, you've got, you know, malware on your network. So, and hopefully you have antivirus that might catch that, or some other level of security that would catch that. But, you know, so you have to look at how those things are connected, and place a value on that. For example, security and privacy awareness training, we do have a mandatory program here that we require all of our users to go through on an annual basis. I get pushback from time to time. Why do I really have to go through that again? It's boring. It's an hour of my time. I could be doing something else more valuable. But the reality is that is an important piece of an information security program. So you have to take a look at that and see what value. Yeah. So as you work through the priorities and your budget, I can actually take this same spreadsheet and I can forecast budget. So I can say, if I got the legislation to appropriate me the budget that I've asked for 2018 and 19, I could create a graph that shows where my platform would be if I were to get that budget. And that becomes a valuable tool as well. So I can use that for budgetary, I can use it for priorities, I can use it for roadmaps. So this is a very valuable tool and an important tool that we use all the time. Let's take a quick look at the CYBRARY. And like I mentioned, that is just a link to an internet website that has thousands, 10,000s of cybersecurity topics and free courses available to anyone. Now, yes, there is some advertising out there. I've found there to be some very valuable courses that I thought that I've taken out there. Here's an example of some courses. We talk about end-user security awareness. If you don't have the budget to do that, you might want to consider using CYBRARY to provide end-user security awareness. Now, CYBRARY doesn't allow you to track who has and who hasn't completed their courses. Again, you probably have to pay for one of the many security awareness training classes that's out there for that. But if your budget doesn't allow you to have that, then this certainly provides you at least to be able to reach out and try to educate your users. And again, that's a valuable tool. Here's another example, risk management framework. We talk about IT, NIST standards. You know, some of your IT folks may be interested in taking a risk management framework class. I know we use Office 365 SharePoint. Many of y'all have talked about using Office 365 SharePoint. Here's a 2-hour class rated as an intermediate on building business applications and creating communications repository in SharePoint. I found that a very valuable course when I went through that class. Incident response and advanced forensics. That's a 1-hour course that's out there. It gives a very good basic description of what we need to be doing in incident response and some forensics tips that can be utilized out there. And I found a cloud security course out there, a 45-minute cloud security. So if you're considering looking at cloud security, then that would be something that you might consider. So I think this is a very valuable resource that we posted out there, CYBRARY, and they're constantly adding new courses out there all the time. Let's talk a little bit about cloud providers. This is one of the first things that we actually developed from the advisory committee, and we took a couple of different school districts that had questions that they asked, and we put them together to create this list. And there's things like simple questions to talk about data ownership. Who owns that data? I'm going to put it out there. Who has access to that data? Is it just my people that have access to that, or do you have administrators that might have access to that data? System updates. What kind of system updates are being done? And how often are they being done? For example, I may have an application server out there that's running an OS, but maybe the middleware that the application's running on isn't going to be upgraded. Is it my responsibility to do that? I've got a database server over there. The OS is being upgraded. Are they going to upgrade the database? Or is that my responsibility? There's a lot of questions around system updates that you want to get clarified when you're dealing in those negotiations. And questions about data protection. Now, I'm using sensitive information. Do I have an option to encrypt that data at rest, and is it being encrypted in transit? Several years ago now, I was in a meeting and we were talking about cloud computing and outsourcing, and one of the people in the audience happened to be former Texas State Auditor John Kill, and he stood up and identified himself and said, I just want to remind you, you can outsource everything except responsibility. And I think this list of questions actually helps us better prepare for the responsibility that we have when we're outsourcing something. I know when my procurement calls and says, hey, we're looking at dealing with a certain vendor, do you have some questions we can ask? I go to the Texas Gateway and pull this list of questions now. And this is the list that I use. And I found it extremely valuable. Let's talk a little bit about incident response handling and the Red Book that's out there. This is a book that was developed by the Texas Department of Information Resources. It was primarily geared towards the agencies, but I found it to be a very valuable tool. I think it's a valuable tool for anyone. Here's what you'll actually find. It's about a 100-page document. There is it starts at the very front with a glossary of terms and acronyms. If you don't have an incident response policy, they have an example of a policy out there. They provide a privacy and security event initial triage checklist. There's a section on event threat and impact analysis, event escalation and communication, who you're going to communicate, when do you communicate with, and there's a whole section on breach notice criteria, and it references Texas Business Code, Texas Education Code. They have a reference out there for FERPA, which would be applicable to most all of the schools. It even has a reference out there for CJIS, or criminal justice, for those that might have a police force that they're working with on their campuses. And there is a post-incident checklist that you can go through to make sure that you're closing everything out. Talk a little bit about the privacy and security event initial triage checklist. I'll be honest with you, we open this up 6 or 8 times a year. Somebody comes to me and goes, "Oh, we're seeing a login on a server from China." Well, I immediately open up the triage book, stamp it, date it, and begin to document what has been reported, who reported it, the exact time of the reporting, what we're working on, what we're doing as we follow through that. And then we find out they're using, Tim Jones ID coming in from China. And we check to see where Tim Jones is on vacation, and he happens to be traveling in China. So the good news in that incident, we get to document that up, close the book, put it away. And we have another incident come up, and we work through those. I open a lot of those books hoping that we get to close them quickly. But you may work through a situation where you may have a compromise or breach. And I'll talk specifically about the difference between those two. You get a workstation that gets malware on it. Technically, that's a compromised machine. Did it have any sensitive information on it that was potentially breached? No. Okay, well, that was just a compromise, and your antivirus cleaned it. So it may have only been compromised. It may have not have been compromised, but detected that beforehand, or it may have started to run the malware and then it detected it. So you can have compromised computer and not have a breach or a potential breach. Potential breach has to do indeed with where there is sensitive information that may have been exposed. Texas Business Code talks about that it doesn't necessarily, you do not have to prove that it was exposed to be a breach, but if there was potential for that data to be exposed. So it does talk about the classification of those two different events, and again, this is a resource that I use very frequently. The last tool that we have out there today is we have 2 incident response exercises, and these are tabletop exercises. They're very short exercises. One has to do with potential grades being changed. One has to do with potential unauthorized access. These are exercises that you could sit down with your IT team and in an hour go through these exercises and just document. They literally have questions. What would you do? What would you do? This step, this develops. What would you do? and you document that, and every time you go through a tabletop exercise like this, you discover things that you didn't document in the last one. And so as you work through 2 or 3 tabletop exercises, you get a better feel of what you might be exposed to should you be in a situation. And you're dealing with, a situation where you might have some exposure, maybe something's been posted in social media, who contacts the media, who contacts, when is somebody going to contact law enforcement? There are a lot of those things that the more that you practice those things, the more likely you're not going to miss a step if you ever have that. Hopefully none of us experience that any time in the future. But I've been through a couple of these where in the private sector where we definitely had exposure. And doing tabletop exercises was a great way to prepare for that. I've allotted about 15 minutes here of our time today for questions, and we've had a couple of questions that have come in that I'm trying to review right now. It looks like people were having trouble with mostly the webinar. I don't see anything that trying to see. There's a lot more questions here than I thought. Let me go through here and take a quick look. So we are planning on posting a recording of this webinar. If there are any questions about that, if you have a question about a slide or something, drop me an email and we'll try to address that. Just looking through, see if we have any other questions. There's a couple of questions about level 1 and how to score that. We're actually going to have a webinar that we will talk more specifically about the scoring system within the within the cybersecurity framework and the risk assessment. We're going to cover those in the next 2 months. So we'll address those, and I have a question here about cloud security and encryption at rest. How do you combat oversharing? And that depends on the level of service that you have with your cloud provider. It depends on how the network is set up on that. I think we can certainly try to work with you with questions regarding that. See if we can't help you with that. I think most of the questions we had today had to do with the questions about webinar sound. It looks like we have all of those. Those were resolved. Question on where you can find these resources, and those are indeed at the texasgateway.org. I will go back to that website real fast. It is this URL, www.texasgateway.org. And you can see that in this screenshot as well. If I'll leave that up for a minute. Somebody, if they need to, can take a a screenshot of that so they can document that. But all of those tools that we had that we've talked about today, the education risk assessment, cybersecurity framework summary, the CYBRARY resource, questions regarding cloud computer, and incident response handling book. And actually, I just sent a note off. Looks like that for some reason has disappeared out of that gateway. They're going to put that back up. But Jarrett, I'll look you up in an address and I'll send you that red book. So I apologize. I just had a note from the folks that published that said that there was a problem and they were republishing that. You know, I have some questions about student published data. Absolutely. You know, that is a big issue. I know that several of y'all have collaborative locations that the students work with, and the information that they put out there is certainly a concern. That's an area that I know is a high concern. Need to look at that data again. That goes to data classification and whether they, you know, I do think that should be considered sensitive information. But you need to look at what the cost is, maybe to encrypt that data. Had a question about shot records, HIPAA. Actually, FERPA lumps HIPAA data into that for K through 12. So they refer to both FERPA and HIPAA records. But we can certainly provide, that'll be something that we can take a look at from the Data Security Advisory Council. We can help provide some guidelines in that arena. Had a question here about my email. We certainly want everyone to be able to reach out to me. It's on the very first slide, frosty.walker@tea.texas.gov. Now, I hopefully look forward to, over the next couple of years, to be able to meet everybody personally. But certainly do not hesitate to drop me a line and see if I can help you. The security plan I had a question about, is the security plan a TE mandate? At this time, it is not. We're not mandating any of that. It is a recommendation. I have worked on this for the last 3 years and found it an extremely helpful tool. Like I said, you know, people used to ask me, you know, where's our security program? I say, well, we're secure today, and knock on wood. But with this, I can actually say, oh, here's where we are today, and that becomes a very valuable tool when you're dealing with leadership. Going through the rest of the questions here to see. Yeah, it looks like a couple of people missed the first slide, so I wanted to make sure everybody has my contact information. The courses that are at that are at CYBRARY, you just have to create a login out there. Those I'll go back to that page real fast. Yes, there it is. You can actually, you go to the click on the CYBRARY link, and you can create a login. Anybody can do that. And you can look through all the courses that are available out there, and literally tens of thousands. You know, I found networking courses all the way to, you know, Cisco certification prep courses. So there's a ton of different resources out there. Had a question about DSAC. If you would drop me the Data Security Advisory Council, if you just drop me an email on that, I can answer questions about that. We are looking to expand that, and we certainly want to be able to help the community that we're trying to serve. So understanding top priority for the folks out there is a key element for us. I'm not planning on mailing out the link for the recording, but it will be posted there on the Texas Gateway under cyber security and cybersecurity tips and tools. But again, if somebody is having trouble finding that, I will. I'll be glad to send that link to you. I do see a couple of people looking for the Red Book. I will send those to you directly, like I said. Let's see, I just got notified that it's not there. Let's see if there's anything else out here. Unfortunately, the screen that has the questions in this is very small. So you have to kind of scroll through this. Mike, I see you have a question out there about administration. I will try to send something, the need for the security, validate the need for the security framework. I'll try to send you something. I will recommend that on that framework, you can work through a framework in a couple of hours. Doesn't take a lot of time to do that. I know that it may take a little more in the initial time frame, but I do think that to be able to have graphics to be able to show where your platform is and create roadmaps is a very valuable tool. So I think that's a very valuable tool. Oh, somebody's actually sent out where that Red Book is indeed at the DR website. But I'll send that link out, and we make sure that we get it out there on the Texas Gateway. I appreciate that information. A couple of questions if I'd like to address. Speaking at a couple of different conferences, I'll go through and document these questions, and I'll send you a note. You know, depending on my schedule, I do not hesitate to speak at conferences because I like meeting face to face with the people that I'm working with, and I appreciate that. Someone is asking me here, what do we use for a security awareness program? We actually use Secure the Human. That does allow us to track each user that has completed it, and we do require that once a year. That goes on their every employee's performance appraisal with all required training. So that's a very valuable tool for us. We've been very pleased with that. You know, I think I'm really doing good with security awareness, and then I do get someone that's going through their junk folder and opens something they shouldn't, and I just go, I want to go back and make sure that they did take that security awareness. But we do use Secure the Human for that. All right, I don't have any other questions here at this time. Again, I want to thank everybody for their time today, and I'll go through these questions and document them, and people that I need to respond to, I'll send that out. Hopefully we'll see y'all all next month on April the, let me look, April the 12th at 1 o'clock. And we'll be talking about the information security plan and the framework. So until then, I hope everybody has a safe spring break, and we'll talk to everybody soon. Thank you all very much.